Like the locked room opens. Darren was going to leave. He had packed his bags, keys in hand, but when he passed the locked door, he saw it. The door was open. Not wide, just an inch. Just enough to see darkness inside. Just enough to hear breathing. It wasn't a normal breath. It came in uneven gasps like someone struggling to hold back laughter. A choked, wheezing giggle. The sound didn't come from one place. It echoed oddly, shifting through the air as if the walls were laughing too. And then something worse. A giggle, light, childlike, but layered beneath it a wet, gasping sob. A slow, rhythmic inhale like someone was savoring the air. And then just behind his shoulder, a voice, his own. "Don't leave me." A breath that wasn't his. Too close, right beside his ear. It wasn't heavy or labored. It was shallow, waiting, listening. He ran. He didn't stop until he was out of the building, out of the city, until he was somewhere safe. But the next morning he woke to an email. Lease renewal notice, Unit 304. It wasn't his name on the contract. It was his. The unseen tenant. The one who had never left. Sippin'. The new arrival. The apartment listing went up the next day. Unbelievably cheap. Fully furnished. Available immediately. And the landlord still had the same tired eyes when he handed the next tenant the keys. "Just one thing," he said. "Don't go into the locked room." The shadow in the reflection. On the fifth night, Darren had had enough. He grabbed a flashlight and stood before the locked door. His breath came slow, measured. The handle didn't budge. The keyhole was stuffed with paper. He pulled out his phone to take a photo of the door. As he checked the image, his stomach dropped. In the reflection of the hallway mirror, the door was slightly open, but there was something else. A thin, pale hand gripped the doorframe from inside the darkness. At first, it was motionless. Then, the fingers twitched, jerky, unnatural movements, like a puppet whose strings had just been pulled. The joints bent in ways they shouldn't, the nails scraping against the wood with a slow, deliberate drag. The hand flexed as if testing itself before it snapped back into the shadows, disappearing too quickly, too silently. But Darren realized there were too many fingers. It twitched, as if adjusting to the light. Then, the fingers snapped back out of sight, but not before Darren saw the nails. They were jagged, broken, and covered in something dark. But it wasn't just pale. It was wrong. The fingers were too long, the joints slightly backward, like they had been reshaped to fit through the gap. A single cracked fingernail scraped against the wood before disappearing again. It withdrew the second Darren turned his head. Something stood behind it. The name that wasn't his. Darren didn't sleep that night. Instead, he researched the building, the apartment, the landlord, and then he found it. An old forum post from 5 years ago. The username was unfamiliar, but the story was the same. Someone who had rented the apartment. Someone who had heard scraping at night. Someone who had noticed things moving. But the last update made Darren's skin crawl. The tenant wrote, "I left, but when I did, my lease renewal arrived, addressed to someone else. The name wasn't mine. It was the name of the tenant before me. The unseen tenant. The apartment no one rented." Darren Collins needed a place fast. The rental market was brutal, but somehow he'd lucked out. An unbelievably cheap apartment in the city, fully furnished, available immediately. It was too good to be true. The apartment smelled faintly of something damp, though no leaks were visible. The wallpaper in the hallway had tiny scratches, but the longer Darren looked, the more he realized they weren't random. They formed symbols, letters in a language he couldn't understand. Beneath the peeling edges, something darker seemed to pulse beneath the surface, like veins. Darren swore he saw the wallpaper shift, like something underneath was breathing, almost like fingernail marks running along the edges of the locked door. When he met the landlord, an elderly man with tired eyes, he barely asked any questions. The lease was already signed. "Just one thing," the landlord said as he handed Darren the keys. "Don't go into the locked room." Darren didn't question it. Not then. But as he took the key from the landlord's hand, he felt a warmth in the metal, pulsing faintly, like a slow heartbeat. The heat didn't fade as he gripped it. It lingered, as if the key had been waiting for him, as if it had been gripped too tightly for too long. When he glanced at the old man's fingers, he noticed something odd. His nails were chipped, and the skin beneath them was dark, almost bruised. But the moment he stepped inside, the apartment felt off. A presence that lingered. The furniture was old but well kept. The air smelled of dust and something faintly sweet like decayed flowers. It felt lived in. That night, as Darren settled in, he noticed something strange. The television remote wasn't where he left it. The kitchen chair was slightly pulled out, though he hadn't touched it. Then, at Shore 37, he heard it. The silence before it was unbearable, a thick, suffocating stillness that made every tiny noise in the apartment seem amplified. Even the distant hum of the refrigerator felt intrusive. He held his breath, straining to hear, but there was nothing. And then it came. Not just the scraping, but something else. A breath, a slow, deliberate inhale just beyond the door. Then silence, then another scrape closer, a faint, deliberate scraping sound. And then a pause. The air felt thicker, heavy, like something was pressing against the other side of the door. Then came a new sound, a whisper, not loud, not external, inside his head, like whoever or whatever was inside had stopped to listen for him. It wasn't hurried, it was methodical, slow, as if something inside was testing the strength of the door, coming from the locked room. 3. Unmoved. Darren tried to ignore it, but every morning, things were slightly different. A towel moved, a light was left on, the locked door seemed warmer. By the third night, he started leaving marks, a glass on the counter, a rug placed at an angle, tiny, deliberate changes to prove to himself that nothing was happening. The next morning, every single thing was back to its original place, as if someone was resetting the apartment, as if someone else lived there too.